So I was talking to one of my friends recently that I catch up with once in a great while, depending on how things are going in life. And so I had the chance to talk to him, and we shared interests around business and things like that. And he was uh, he was saying how that Tim Francis had essentially, he said that the this idea of passive income is kind of a myth, essentially, or maybe that's not the words that he used, but that's the idea. Because even when you do something that even if you go out and, like, let's say you acquire a business, okay, right? So in theory that should be like really passive, right? You're just acquiring a business, you're just buying a business, and the business makes you money, like yay. Well, of course, the reality is that even after you buy a business, normally you do have to do some work to you know to keep it running at peak efficiency, if you will. But in order to purchase that business, you may have to go and knock on doors, essentially. So you got your prospecting, right? You've got your due diligence. You've got all those phases of the deal making process, and then finally closing on the business. So let's say that business generates, let's say, $500,000 in profits every year for you. Um, and let's say that you hold that business for 10 years and sell it. And so your overall profit, let's say you profit another, let's say, twice that on the sale, right? So essentially you made $10 million on your overall transaction for that entire. You bought the business, you held it for 10 years, you sold it, you made 10 million. Okay. Well, even if you did no work on that business after you owned it, um, there was probably still some work in selling it, right? You still had to work on the paperwork and maybe find the buyer and all that jazz. Um, so in that case, you had the initial, process of finding and acquiring a business, and then the actual process of selling the business. So in theory, in between it was passive, right? But you still had those two bookends on there, and so essentially, this is going into a bit more detail than what my friend relayed to me, but this is just kind of laying out a scenario of like something that in theory is supposed to be quite passive, right? Buying a business, potentially is supposed to be quite rather passive, right? But in reality, um, you still spent time on it and made a certain amount of money. So essentially, you could argue that everyone has a dollars per hour number. Now, there might be extreme cases, like let's say you're a trust fund baby, and just for being born, you got $1 billion, and your family office takes care of all the everything financial, and you just get money put into your bank account on a regular schedule. Okay, in that case, that's truly passive, right? But for most of us who were not born into that type of wealth, um, there's ultimately still a dollar per hour number. It just varies on what that number is. So um, maybe you invest in the in an index fund that automatically withdraws from your account, and so on and so forth. And let's say you do that while you're during your prime working years. um, and so that income over time, is that passive income? I mean, that is pretty passive. You gotta admit that's pretty sneaking passive. You don't even have to do the work of like putting money into your account, but you have to set it up right. And then over time you may have to do maybe some withdrawal work that you have to do, or some management. Likely very little, but maybe a little bit. So in theory, you know, I think that, so in theory, there's still a number in terms of return per hour spent. And of course, now if you figure in the hours you spent at your regular day job to be able to invest, of course, that's also a very real way to think about what your per hour rate is. So I don't think it's the idea that we should necessarily run away from this idea of getting paid for our time, because essentially, like I said, except for extreme edge cases, to some extent, we're all getting paid for our time. Now, that being said, there are very different ways to get paid for your time. So, for instance, if you prefer to get paid by making deals, and the time you spend making deals doesn't feel like punching a clock. It feels very different. Well, that's great. It's sure you may still be getting paid a certain X number of dollars per hour, but it doesn't feel like that, right? So you don't have to feel like you're locked into just some kind of, dead end, only getting paid X number of dollars for X number of hours. It doesn't need to feel that way, but it's probably a good idea to realize that most passive investments aren't truly 100% passive, for starters, or passive income streams aren't usually completely passive. And secondly, to realize that there are still more passive ways versus less passive ways. And thirdly, that even though there maybe is a dollar amount attached to your unit, your hour, that it doesn't mean you have to feel like a slave to the hours as a direct tie to the dollars.